Lost command.
What is the counterplay to casting your 4?
Casting
Cast
speed.
Casting speed. I mean, I've never saw a man so intent to press 2 in his life.
Bro, I didn't have rolling guard. It was a grenade. And I tried to, I was like, oh, surely I can just walk to the other side of it, but the fucking wall has a huge ass hitbox.
Hey man, maybe you should get Caliban 3, keeps you alive.
That's
Listen, I only had 2 of them up. Trust, I only had 2 of them up.
That's an intro. Hello and welcome to the Warframe tier list. Today we'll be going over Ashe, and first things first, let's go over the builds. So with Ashe, I have a couple different builds, and the first one is a Bladestorm focused build running Silence with the Savage Silence Augment. Savage Silence gives you additional finisher damage, which of course buffs Bladestorm as Bladestorm counts as finisher damage. Savage Silence only buffs the initial hit damage that Bladestorm deals and not the slash procs that they apply. Savage Silence also scales with ability strength, which is why I'm running Multi-Augmented. Multi-Augmented double dips as it not only increases the base damage of the Bladestorm, but then the Savage Silence finisher damage buff. I'm also running Arcane Fury, as Arcane Fury gives you a melee damage increase that scales as a final damage multiplier on Bladestorm. Speaking of, I am running Brief Respite, though if you don't care about getting a full shield gate reset, with your abilities, you can choose to drop Brief Respite for Steel Charge for even more damage and more capacity, so you have to forma him less. I'm running Blind Rage plus Equilibrium to sustain, though an alternative is to run Transient Fortitude and Umbral Intensify instead, and this nets you roughly the same damage, well, the exact same damage for roughly the same sustain as well. The downside is now you can no longer shield gate fully with Shuriken even when running Brief Respite, as you need Blind Rage to do so. This is what I was using for survival. In non-survival missions, you can drop Stretch. In survival, I find that the extra range on Silence is pretty important, as what you're going to be doing is casting Bladestorm on a group of enemies and then walking away to a different group of enemies. That way you're not wasting your time shooting enemies that are already going to die anyway. But outside of a survival, you can definitely drop Stretch for something like Smoke Shadow for team utility and also crit chance for your weapons, Rising Storm for quality of life, or Seeking Shuriken for an armor strip. I preferred Smoke Shadow. As the second build, it is another Bladestorm build, but using Roar instead. Roar buffs the initial damage and the dot damage that Bladestorm deals, giving you slightly more damage than Silence. The downside is that the damage is backloaded instead of front-loaded, as most of the damage is now coming from the slash dot rather than the initial hit damage. The upside is Roar frees up 2 mod slots in a survival setting and 1 mod slot in other settings, as you do not need Savage Silence, and in survival you do not need the additional range. This means that you can always run Smoke Shadow, and you can run 44% additional ability strength from Umbral Intensify. Same thing with Blind Rage and Equilibrium. You can choose to swap these out with other strength mods or sustain options. Another thing you can do is you can choose to drop one of these arcanes, probably multi-augmented, for Arcane Trickery. Arcane Trickery is nice as, again, Bladestorm counts as finishers, so every time your Bladestorm kills an enemy, you have a 15% chance to become invisible for 30 seconds, meaning that you will not have to upkeep Smokescreen, increasing your sustain very slightly. In the end, I did prefer the Roar build, as it just felt a bit better. Silence does have the benefit of increasing your survivability massively, though, as Silence is a very good survivability tool. As to the final build, it is just a Ensnare build similar to what I was running on Loki. The upside of running Ensnare on Loki, or Ensnare on Ashe over Loki, is you get access to Smoke Shadow, again for the team utility and crit chance, but you also have access to Ashe's passive for the additional bleed damage and bleed duration. Some downsides to running this build on Ashe instead of Loki is survivability is a bit more rough, as you can't really fully shield gate on this build, as you don't really want to run Blind Rage, as strength is irrelevant, and you don't have access to Loki's 3 augment, so your just survivability is just a bit worse, but you do have higher scaling potential. Now for the weapon loadout, I was using a miter primary again, and you should probably get used to this, as the miter is one of my favorite weapons. Is not only is it strong, but I also find it very fun to use. This was the weapon load I was using for the Ensnare build, Continuous Misery, so that way that the gas clouds would last even longer, and of course a Riven. Without a Riven, you could choose to slot something like Amalgam Serration, Bladed Rounds, or something like Hunter Munitions to benefit from Ash's passive. Speaking of Hunter Munitions for Ash's passive, that is another reason why I like the Miter, especially on Ash, as even with this build, you can see that the primary, like the direct hit, is heavily slash weighted, so even without Hunter Munitions, you get a decent bit of slash procs on your primary target, meaning that you just outright kill heavy enemies like Exodus, like very quickly without needing gas, or without needing to armor strip, even without Hunter Munitions. For disruption, I was using a heat miter, utilizing a heat inherit setup. I was using Galvanized Aptitude. I know that this only works for 44% of the initial hit damage and 0% of the AoE, but in the end, I did math it out, and this was more damage than Amalgam Serration as long as you have at least 10 statuses, which is very easy with a Kompressa with secondary encumber. And not only that, the 80% status chance on a heat build is also very beneficial. If you run Roar, even without a Riven, you could very easily kill a level cap demo without armor stripping as Ash with the Miter. As to the secondary, I was using this Kompressa for single target priming and also for heat inherit shenanigans. This was the Riven, just 50% damage to Grenier for heat inherit. Other secondaries that work are the Epitaph for AoE priming, Kompressa or Kuvanukor for pseudo AoE plus popping nullifier bubbles. Tenet Cycron works. If you just want a secondary for dealing damage, I would highly suggest the Lex Incarnate on Ash, as it deals forced impact procs in the Incarnate form, and it has low fire rate, meaning that you can slot Hemorrhage for a 70% chance to apply Slash on impact. Again, it just works very well in general, and on Ash it would be amazing. Without a Riven, just slot Lethal Torrent. As to the melee, I was using a Praetos with this build for the 30% parkour velocity and 20% sprint speed, Jesus. Attack speed does work on Bladestorm, but it only scales up to 50%. And I was just running extra to help build combo up if I ever lost it. And speaking of combo, everything else is just for combo gain. True Punishment's additional combo count chance and Quickening's combo count chance do work on Bladestorm, basically just getting you up to 12x combo very, very quickly. You might be looking at True Punishment and thinking that it's annoying because it's slowing your combo duration. However, it's not as bad as it seems, as you can see I have 30.5 seconds of combo duration, and once I take it off, it only goes up to 33. So True Punishment is pretty much a free slot. As to the focus schools, you can either run Zenric for energy sustain, Vazarin for a bit of extra survivability with a protective sling, Unaru for prime sure-footed if you do not have prime sure-footed and access to an easy-to-use armor strip, or Madurai for 50% casting speed, 40% ability strength, and 30% physical damage. Last but not least, I was using a Panzer with a standard Panzer build with the synth mods equipped for Equilibrium. I also took off Tech Assault for Sharpened Claws. Now, moving on to the rankings, we're discussing Ash in relation to 4 separate topics. Firstly is KPM, secondly is survivability, thirdly is viability, and finally how fun he is to play. All of this data is sampled from a 1-hour solo Steel Path Mont run with no Spectres, no On-Call, and of course no Archon shards. Now let's begin with the first topic, Ash's KPM. Ash is capable of incredibly high KPM thanks to him being an invis frame with high survivability, allowing him to use pretty much any helmet of the game, like Loki. He also benefits from having a passive that amplifies the damage and duration of bleed ticks, allowing your weapons to scale for even longer, especially if you just go a gun build with something like Roar. Bladestorm is also an ability that can kill enemies all the way up to level cap, though it does stop killing Eximus at around level 1000, as they just have too much health when you take into account Overguard, especially since viral procs do not increase damage that you deal versus the Overguard health pool. This is a bit annoying, as Bladestorm is already kind of low KPM by itself, so the fact that it does eventually fall off is kind of an L, but you just have to take it for what it is. In Disruption, Bladestorm is nice, as what you can do is you can cast Blade Storm as you're running to the Demos once you hear the beeping, and once you get to the Demos, you can just release your Blade Storm, and it will kill all the enemies behind you so you don't randomly get ganked while you're dealing with the demo. In a survival, however, using Blade Storm is an active detriment to your KPM, unfortunately, as it just takes too much time to set up, and you already have to look at the enemies, and in 2023, if you already have to look at the enemy, you could have just shot them instead of looking at them and pressing like your 4 to release them and slowly kill them. So, since you already had to look at them, and it's not an instant kill with the ability, you could have just shot them. Pretty much, the rule of thumb that I came up with from what I've experienced is whatever weapon you're using, if you're actively using Blade Storm, you could have gotten about 20 KPM higher if you just instead just didn't use Blade Storm. And the problem is, you're just using Blade Storm, targeting the enemies, then running to a different group of enemies while Blade Storm slowly kills them. It just doesn't kill them quick enough, and it takes too much time to target them. In my opinion, Blade Storm needs a soft rework where it's just an AoE around you, either like an active where you just press it and it will target all the enemies around you instantly, or something like a channeled ability where it will just auto target enemies around you for an energy cost. I don't know. In my opinion, it just needs something because it's really outdated now. Unfortunately, it is really fun to use, but unfortunately, it is just outdated. Ashe also has access to his passive, like I previously mentioned, and the 150% crit chance from his 2 Augment, and he can make use of an Ensnare build with full DPS arcanes. So if you just run a gun Ashe with either Ensnare with a gas build, or just Roar or Eclipse or something like that, you do go back to having very high KPM potential thanks to all of his different buffs. Because of all these reasons, I would suggest you just don't use Blade Storm unless you're doing a disruption, and just play a gun or melee Ashe build outside of disruption. And in those circumstances, he does have S tier KPM, so I will give him S rank, as Blade Storm is really good in disruption, and gun Ashe is really good outside of disruption. Now moving on to the second topic is survivability, and this should be fairly short. Ashe is just an invis frame, so he at base already has incredibly high survivability. The problems that he has with his survivability, it is a struggle to shield gate with him unless you play base Ashe, as base Ashe has 75 shield compared to Ashe Prime's 94. And he also has a low energy pool, so sustaining your energy can be a bit of a problem, and if you run out of energy you can die. Outside of that though, his survivability is completely fine, especially if you're running the silence build, then you're completely fine. If you're running Roar or something, your survivability does go down a bit as you no longer have the silence CC, but again it just goes back to, you're an invis frame, you're invisible, like, you should be fine. If you die as an invis frame, like, you just shouldn't. If you do, you probably did something stupid, or like you just got like, I don't know, you just got warframed and something dumb happened. So like, it is what it is. Pretty much any invis frame, if you have invisibility, you have high survivability. That's just how it is. So Ashe S- tier survivability, not much more to be said. Now moving on to his viability, and his viability is also high, though it's not as high as Loki's, as he's worse in defense and excavator. He's significantly worse in excavators, he's slightly worse in defense, and he's also very slightly worse in spy. Across the board elsewhere though, he's roughly the same, maybe slightly higher. In disruption, he's a lot higher than Loki, but that's just because Ashe is like, Ashe and Revenant are like the 2 best disruption frames. I wouldn't even say they're the best disruption frames, I'd say that they're the easiest disruption frames. But that does give them a plus, as well, if you're just not too good at disruption or you're learning disruption, they're really good frames to fall back on. I will give Ashe an A rank for his viability, as again, he's just across the board about the same as Loki, slightly worse in some places, slightly better in others. Now moving on to the final topic, his fun, and I do think Ashe is pretty fun with the 4 build, and you can also do a Mark for Death build, which is also incredibly fun, though it has the same problem that Blade Storm builds do, where you're wasting so much time trying to set up for a nuke that like you could have just shot the enemies. Mark for Death is a bit worse for it, as you're specifically looking for extremely tanky enemies like Eximus units, or heavy gunners or bombards, and obviously that they take longer to find. And Mark for Death is also affected by line of sight, so you pretty much also cap out with Mark for Death at around like 100 to 110 kpm, just like Bladestorm. But they are fun builds. Like, Mark for Death builds are really fun, and Bladestorm builds are also really fun. And then outside of that, you're just running General Ensnare or General Roar Eclipse builds, which are average. So he has multiple really fun builds, and then he also has multiple average builds. So I will give him a slightly above average fun rank. So I will give him an A- rank for his fun. He is decently fun, and I feel like there's probably a build for everyone, just like Loki. Like, you can really run whatever helmet ability you want, because you're just an invis frame, so you can do whatever you want. So there's that. There is one downside to Ash's fun rank though, and that is you don't have to, but I feel kind of compelled to run slash weapons on him just because of his passive. Though that's definitely just me. You could just forgo his passive and just run non-slash weapons, but I don't know. I feel like I have to run a slash weapon whenever I play Ash, which does take a bit away. In conclusion, Ash is an A+ tier Warframe who is nearly identical to Loki, though he just has a bit of extra damage in his kit thanks to his passive, passively increasing his damage output with Slash, and also his 2 Augment giving him a crit chance buff on his weapons, allowing him to scale into the later levels with ease. Another thing that you may notice is the tier list has shifted a bit. I have moved Revenant up to S- as his new augment that he has for his Mesmer skin is absolutely insane and buffed the crap out of his viability. And I also moved Chroma up a bit, up from C to B-, as I did get a couple things wrong in the Chroma video, as I was unaware that his Vex Armor buff actually was a weapon damage buff, meaning that it affects things like Breach Surge and abilities like it.